Hello, thank you. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all. My name is Suryas. Previous slide, please. Yes. My name is Suryas K. Namdev. I'm speaking from Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. Here today, I'll talk about science diplomacy and various aspects of it, whether it is the science or the national interest that comes first when we talk about something like science diplomacy. So let's move to the next slide, please. Thanks. So, science diplomacy is a recently used or evolved terminology. It has like the conceptual understanding of it is still evolving. So, the one of the basic frameworks that came to define science diplomacy is the one proposed by put forward by Royal Society and AAAS, which talks about three different dimensions or components of science diplomacy, which are science in diplomacy, science for diplomacy, and diplomacy for science. Science in diplomacy is basically where science is used for many diplomatic activities like negotiations of international treaties, whether it could be for climate change or space or nuclear, where science is an important component of negotiations. Then there is science for diplomacy, where scientific scientific enterprises are used to further diplomatic efforts. For example, in places like CERN and CERN and CISME in Middle East, where you see science bringing nations together. And then there is diplomacy for science, when diplomatic efforts are done to advance scientific enterprises. That also you see in many mega science projects and international scientific collaborations. Next slide, please. This is one framework. There is another framework. So this framework talks about things of science diplomacy from the point of view of processing. There's an alternative framework developed by chief science advisors of different countries and published in 2018. This which talks about things from the point of view of intentions or objectives of doing some science diplomacy activities. And it's again divided into three different categories. So science, one is action directly advance the science countries' national needs. Second is about addressing cross-border interests, as we see in many things like Arctic diplomacy or space diplomacy and or ocean diplomacy and so on. And then there are address common challenges, international global common challenges, and there are actions taken to address those global challenges, like what we see with the climate change and so on. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thanks. So again, from looking of the point of view of cooperation and competition, there are certain conditions that would kind of promote cooperations among nations when it comes to scientific enterprises. That could be conditions like complementary scientific and technical strengths between two countries, which are also supported by some political or geopolitical motives. Then we would see a lot of cooperations happening in that direction. Then another key driver of this could be part of like larger strategies of countries to promote cooperation. It can also be like promoting soft power of one country in another country or broader regions. One example of it was the Cairo speech in 2009 by President Obama, that was given to Arabic countries, and promoting cooperation with American scientific industry and so on in the Middle East. Then there are various conditions that can also promote competition when it comes to science diplomacy, and these conditions are like having a similar scientific and technical strengths, and there is a competition to gain market access for particular technologies. For example, many key and emerging technologies like AI and so on, we see that countries compete a lot to gain a market access and gain intellectual property rights. So that's one case when we see competition. There is also often a race for tech supremacy when it comes to emerging technologies like AI and blockchain and so on. So those are the things that can drive competition. Next slide, please. Then now, like seeing science diplomacy from the point of view of national interest. So there could be a totally different presentation talking about science, tech, and innovation diplomacy from looking at from the point of view of globalist side, international side, where how international collaboration or cooperation can drive science diplomacy. But here in this particular presentation, I'm talking about national interest and how national interest sometimes drive science diplomacy. So scientific cooperation in strategic areas, again, mentioning emerging technologies. For example, we have between Canada and the UK, there is a cooperation in the area of quantum technologies. Another is soft power projection. Again, very key national interest for many countries, and science diplomacy is very helpful in driving that. Again, engagement with STEM diaspora. So many countries like India and China have a huge STEM diaspora living in other countries, and leveraging that STEM diaspora for developing their own national R&D strength is one of the key national interests for these countries, and there is also science diplomacy very useful. Then leveraging scientific capacity of other countries, so to build the bridges and also gain the technical know-how of many key and important technologies is another area which is between science diplomacy and national interest. And then mega science projects, projects like CERN and SESAME and many other International Solar Alliance. These kind of large projects can really help drive both the national interest as well as the scientific capacity of any country. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah. So technology diplomacy. Now, technology from the scientific side, we see a lot more globalist or international cooperation side coming. But when it comes to technology side of things, there is actually a lot more competition than cooperation among different countries. There are various concepts like tech sovereignty, which is essentially countries trying to have sovereign control over important technologies. Like countries want to have a better control about the data and digital technologies that are there. So all this debate about 5G and so on is part of maintaining tech sovereignty of any country over the key technologies used in that particular area or that particular country. And techno-nationalism is basically when technology and nationalism are fused together. So sometimes when technological advancement are used for nationalistic purposes, for example, NASA's achievements in space were used to build a kind of a nationalism in the US in the 60s and 70s. Same in the Soviet Union of the time. Similarly, now the same kind of things might be happening in future with artificial intelligence, with drones, with robots, and so on, where technological advancement of country is shown in fusion or intersection with the nationalism that is there. Another important area when it comes to tech diplomacy is managing the international big tech companies, global tech giants like Google, Apple, Amazon, and so on, which have enormous influence and power due to their dominance in the digital space. And like, to say the least, that makes many countries very uneasy about it. Like, they want to have some degree of control of better regulation over these tech giants. And how that can be done is a very important area of tech diplomacy of today. So many countries discussing within themselves, but also with other countries, how to better regulate these companies. And then there is a global tech governance. In addition to managing the tech companies, there is also issue of how the rules and regulations and norms and standards should be set up for many emerging technologies, including artificial intelligence, including 5G, and maybe in future 6G and blockchain and so on, cryptocurrency. What should be the rules and regulations for governance of these futuristic technologies? So another important area of tech diplomacy, where national interest also play a very important role. Next slide, please. So now, again, another related thing. So when I say science diplomacy, it is often considered both science, technology, and innovation diplomacy. So I'm talking about these three in parts. So I talked about science diplomacy and technology diplomacy. Now moving to innovation diplomacy. Similar to tech diplomacy, innovation diplomacy is also driven more by competition, emotion of competition, than by cooperation. Countries want to get more foreign direct investment for development of their own national areas of R&D, their own strengths in the research and development. So that's one very important objective, key national interest for many countries. Then international technology transfer to build the technological strengths where they are not there. again part of innovation diplomacy, because all of this happens through these international large negotiations involving innovative technologies. Then international access to domestic innovative products. So countries, when some countries develop some technologies, especially this is true in the area of defense technologies, when countries develop a defense technology, they would want to sell it to another country. And there is a competition among different international players to sell, for example, weapon technologies to other countries. But that's not limited to weapon technology. It also happens in all kind of areas, from telecommunication to biotechnology and so on. Now, another important area in terms of innovation diplomacy is shaping the international intellectual property rights regimes. So IPR regimes are a very, very important part of how the trade and discussion on various aspects of technology happens. And countries want to have favorable IPR regimes that support their own technologies and their own advancements. So another important area for innovation diplomacy. Could you please move to the next slide? So these are some of the references and further readings. In general, when it comes to tech and innovation diplomacy, countries in the global north traditionally had a larger say because they were technologically more advanced. They were in much better position to set up the rules and regulations when it comes to technological norms and standards, and even put tech embargoes. So, for example, nuclear embargoes for other countries to not being able to develop nuclear weapons. That's just one extreme example, but all kind of other tech embargoes were put on. So countries in the global south now really want to participate in this making of these standards and have a larger say there. Instead of being just a rule takers, they want to be rule makers and rule shapers. And that's another important area of STI diplomacy as it is evolving. So these are some of the references you can go through. Next slide, please. Yeah, with this, I would like to end my presentation, and I'm open for all questions. Thank you. I hope I was on time. I do not see any questions. Wait 1 second. There is one question, I think. So the question is from Sweta Ganpati, and she's asking, what are some key priorities for Indian space of science diplomacy and cooperation? So I would say for India, we have recently developed a new division in the Ministry of External Affairs called New and Emerging Strategic Technology Division, which is kind of driving many of the science, tech, innovation, diplomacy related questions. So in terms of India's priorities, we want to be, as I was mentioning, as many other countries of the global south, we want to be rule makers or rule shapers. So we want to be there when all these international discussions go on establishing different rules regarding technological norms and standards. Second, we want to develop our own national strength in many of these technologies through international cooperation, of course. And for that, we are also having many programs with, especially with Quad countries now, where we are trying to develop our strengths in emerging technologies and also exchange words with the like-minded countries, exchange notes with the like-minded countries in that regard. We also are cooperating with many countries on SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. Again, very, very important areas, especially for a country like India, where we really need to work on a lot on those SDGs. So that's another key priority area. So those are some of them. Thank you.
Thank you for this opportunity to share our research from National Taiwan University. Today, I want to talk about a journey of 3 countries. They all came a long way from the early 2000s. They all went through 3 major pandemics, survived, thrived, and made progress. Canada, Singapore, and Taiwan experienced the SARS outbreak in 2003. The pandemic vanished as fast as how it arrived before we even thought about developing vaccines. 6 years later, H1N1 hit. This time, vaccines were developed, and there was an unprecedented vaccination campaign globally. By April 2010, an estimated 41% of Canadians aged 12 or older had had the shot. Then comes COVID-19, the pandemic that derailed the world for nearly 2 years. But during this plight, countries were writing history. We could see that Canada, Singapore, and Taiwan all responded very swiftly at the border control containment. Vaccine task forces were formed early in April and June 2020 in Singapore and Canada, respectively. So how did Canada, Singapore, Taiwan respond to COVID-19 in terms of vaccine acquisition strategy? Several crucial timelines could be referenced for policy analysis. Timelines for vaccine task force formation, inking of bilateral deals, vaccine shipment, vaccine coverage in the population, and the timeline for planning of booster shots. So while Canada and Singapore managed to ink bilateral vaccine deals very early on in August 2020, Taiwan went through several hurdles in vaccine deals. The first bilateral deal made by Taiwan was in October 2020, but it was canceled due to various reasons. This has an impact on the first vaccine shipment being delivered in Canada and Singapore by December 2020, while the timeline dragged until March 2021 for Taiwan, while Canada and Singapore already reached 10% vaccination coverage. However, Taiwan soon picked up the pace after the first community outbreak in May 2021, realizing that border control was not invincible. So in order to take a bird's eye view to these different systems in the three countries, we employed the 5 pillars in the white paper Learning from SARS published by 2003 to assess the policy decisions. These 5 pillars were governance, research, strength, public capacity, and destination. We used causal layered analysis, CLA in short, as a framework to narrate the story. CLA was developed by Professor Sohail Inayatullah. It was a theory and a methodology can be applied to sustain a meaningful change. Oftentimes, we have a vision of what we are looking for, but we don't have the systemic enabler. We have a vision, but we stumble upon our cultures and we don't have a supportive metaphor to transform. It's like looking at the tip of an iceberg, we don't know where it stems from. CLA can take us through these 4 levels: litany, causes, worldviews, myth, and metaphor, and enable us to digest our existing circumstances and create better narratives for the future. So for Canada, despite making a lot of bilateral deals in 2020, the reality of not receiving adequate supply of vaccines surfaced in early 2021. Canada is also the only highly developed country to join COVAX. Why did Canada, the nation that ordered more vaccines per capita than any other nations in the world, come to this point? Systemically, Canada show a fragmented policy decision-making scene. There are vetoes in the University of Saskatchewan, National Microbiology Lab, and Canadian Science Centre conducting vaccine-related research. However, interdisciplinary departments were lacking, which had been pointed out immediately after SARS. And Canada was not seen as a destination for global vaccine company production. The strength of Canada, however, is on international trade, for example, on some essential medical resources such as PPE. So the reflective worldview of Canada's response centered around being a good global citizen, caring about social justice. That could explain why Canada believes in joining COVAX to engage in the responsibility to help other countries. At the same time, the long tradition of living in a multicultural society had made Canada forbearing. However, when Canada saw the neighbor getting the presents long before they did, the feeling might be like being the good kid for the entire year, but it's the sibling who had a tantrum that got the cool gift. So to transform this vision, we have seen that Canada wants to make a guest room for Santa. Canada still believes in active global citizenship and social justice, but this time, Canada is doing globalization by becoming the next global pivot to produce what the world needs. The federal government was enabled to have more power to negotiate and to decide what to invest. There's Budget 2021 to create a better bioscience ecosystem. The Biologics Manufacturing Center was built in Montreal, guaranteeing thousands of new jobs. And so Canada built a future that's home to bioengineering. Let's move our lens to Singapore. The Lion City, being an international trading hub, was its rooted tradition. Singapore relied heavily on international trade, and in late 2020, Singapore realized that the vaccine supply was not self-sufficient. Systemically, Singapore showed a highly top-down coordinated policy decision with a high negotiation level for vaccine deal right at the beginning of the pandemic. Its strength includes prior investment in new technology through its sovereign fund and a vibrant biotech ecosystem as the regional HQs to several global pharma companies. Singapore has a Gansu spirit, referring to being afraid to lose out in the race. Thus, always wants to make sure it is safe on a rainy day, believing that nothing money cannot buy. They are really like the crazy rich Asians and are using every connection to make sure their kids can be elected as the homecoming king or queen at the prom. So instead of waiting for the invitation to the prom, the anxious parents decided to host a regional prom party at home. They still hold the Gansu worldview, but the strategy is transformed. Singapore has been advocating comprehensive multilateral free trade networks with favorable tax environments. Vaccines with made in Singapore options were served on the plate. The final goal will be not only to supply domestic vaccine needs, but also to supply the region. Last but not least, Taiwan. In the early stage of the pandemic, Taiwan depend upon moral suasion and extremely compliant citizens for the pandemic response. Taiwan's stringent border control measures have allowed the government to buy more time to formulate the vaccine strategy. There are Academia Sinica, National Health Research Institute, and domestic vaccine manufacturers conducting vaccine-related research. With small domestic vaccine manufacturing capacity, the decision was to focus on homemade vaccines very early on. However, when Taiwan went through difficulties in securing the commercial vaccine deals coupled with the failed COVAX system, it became apparent that the vaccine self-sufficiency was not achievable. Over a long period of time, Taiwan found herself losing the voice on the global stage due to the contended sovereign situation. Being by the rest of the world is not foreign. So a cross-generation worldview of why is it not us prevails in society. Taiwan was prone to focusing on short-term low-hanging fruits because of the ambiguous identity on the world stage. Taiwan was like a tiny yet energetic lady who was not invited to the prom where all the cool kids could go. Every step she walked was just like struggling in the mud. So Taiwan decided to seek a future that could stand on the shoulders of giants by walking herself to the world with a worldview of Taiwan can help and Taiwan is helping. Through this international advocacy, we have seen that Taiwan has received generous vaccine donations from the international community. By accepting the ambiguity, Taiwan has adopted a new public-private partnership, PPP, to delegate the vaccine procurement to reputable entities with global standings as Foxconn, TSMC, and Tsuji Foundation. In parallel, the pipelines of Made in Taiwan vaccine continue to carry on. To sum up, we gave an overview of the vaccine acquisition policy as a snapshot of these three countries. A shared future vision is to ramp up domestic vaccine self-sufficiency to prepare for the pandemics. By using the CLA framework to take a deep dive into these decisions, we believe that a long-term sustained change for the pandemic preparedness could be envisioned. I hope you have enjoyed walking the journey of three countries so far. We are all under the threat of an unprecedented pandemic. Each country has a story to tell, but I did believe at the end of the day, there is going to be a bird called hope that soars above the sorrows of human beings and transform into a future that we all look forward to. These are my team members contributing to this work. Thank you very much. So far, nothing at the moment.
Thanks so much. And welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining our session. I'm pleased to be speaking today about why should Canada consider, or should Canada consider, a Bayh-Dole Act. My name is Ariel Lukacs, and I'm Vice President of Strategy and Positioning with Stiletto, which is a market research and strategic planning firm specializing in high impact projects for communities and institutions. And we work at the intersection of government, industry, and academia, which can tell you why I'm passionate about this topic. And so I'll start with an introduction or a refresher if you're familiar with the Bayh-Dole Act. It was adopted in 1980, and it allowed nonprofit organizations and small businesses to retain intellectual property or IP of their invention that was made under federally funded research programs. And the Act addressed two key points. The first, who obtains ownership of IP rights of an invention patented using federal funding? And then second, how are those IP rights managed? And the goal of the Act was really to help mobilize innovation created with government funding into commercialization by A, giving the inventors the IP ownership, and B, encouraging technology transfer activities. So I did throw a couple of terms at you. So just to make it, again, a refresher introduction, technology transfer is really how knowledge that is developed within academia is communicated to the private sector for industrial and commercial purposes. And then key IP elements include patents, trademarks, copyrights, and industrial designs. And so the two major provisions of the Bayh-Dole Act were that nonprofits, including post-secondary institutions or PSIs, and small businesses were expected to file patents on invention they elected to own. And then second, the nonprofits, or in this case PSIs, were expected to give licensing preference to small business. And so the goal of this was really to take, before the Bayh-Dole, the US government owned the results of the research it financed. And as a result of that, less than 5% of patents that were owned by the federal government were actually marketed and yielding results for the general public. And another problem was that post-secondary institutions and the private sector would often not work together, mostly because the private sector was worried that any new innovation would just be lost to government ownership and they won't be able to act on it. Now, after the Bayh-Dole Act, there was really an exponential increase in university and college research from faculty and students, with about 3 new companies and 3 new technologies being commercialized every day from academic research. And just to give you a magnitude, between 96 and 2017, for example, academic patent licenses contributed 1.7 trillion to the economy and supported 6 million jobs. And a few success stories you probably have heard of between Google and Tableau, Allegra for allergy, and Flu Mist as an alternative to the flu shot were all developed by researchers at academic institutions. And so now you might be wondering, well, is this even relevant to Canada? Do we need to have this conversation? Because the government in Canada doesn't own the IP that is created using its funding. But I would argue this conversation is important for 2 main reasons. First, the Bayh-Dole addressed an existing problem. In that case, it was the who owns the IP being the government. And it provided a framework to really support and improve the commercialization activity from the post-secondary sector. And then the problem we do have in Canada is we have lower than possible levels of commercialization of academic-based innovation, of academia industry collaboration for commercialization, And then investment in R&D as a share of GDP has been steadily declining since 2001. It is mainly due to business R&D expenditure, but that can really be compensated by the academic R&D expenditure, which mostly comes from government, if it actually helps with innovation and commercialization and productization. And just to give you an example of how the two countries fare, if we adjust for our currency, for each $10 million in research expenditure in the US, 2.13 new patents or patent applications occur, while in Canada, for $10 million in research expenditure, only 1.27 new patent applications occur. And that actually has been declining regularly since 2015. And I argue that it is really important to improve patenting, commercialization, and technology transfer to really increase the number of patents executed in our country, to increase academic spin-out companies, so that's direct commercialization, or availability of academic-based innovation to the private sector, and increase in academia-industry collaboration, including industry adopting and applying the research to really commercialize and support the general public with products. And that would result in private firms taking advantage of academic expertise and publicly funded research, academic institutions generating revenue and disseminating new knowledge, consumers to gain access to new products and services. So all of us benefiting from the money being put into academic research, and then improved global competitiveness and advantage for Canada. And so if we don't have the barrier of the government owning the IP, what barrier do we have? So we have actually a few. So one, there is no legislation that governs the management of IP that results from publicly funded research, at least not in a cohesive way. And so that results in different IP policies at Canadian post-secondary institutions. And that would be mostly either university-owned or inventor-owned or professor-owned. There is a lack of awareness of importance of IP in the academic sector and within the administration and the researchers themselves. Lack of readily available access to information about what IP already exists across Canada, which means that there is a lack of connection opportunity between IP holders and customers. And funding programs really do not support activities that are vital to commercialization, or really money that is meant to cross this valley of death that I'm sure many of you have heard of, to really demonstrate the commercial potential of academic IP to reach market entry. And then lastly, which is a big issue, is really the mentality and the incentives and support structures for IP commercialization and industry engagement in Canada is not as strong as it could be. And I'll just give you an example. So again, if we adjust for currency, technology transfer offices that are very common in the US, slightly less in Canada, for two universities with the same order of magnitude for research expenditures. In the Canadian university, the technology transfer office has a staff of 5, while the American university, the staff is actually 26, with really expertise from end to end of the commercialization process. And you can imagine that can help support commercialization activities much better. And so what is the solution? We can consider a few components, and this is where I want to get everybody thinking. So first of all, should we have a uniform IP strategy? What is the ownership model? It is a long discussion. I'll touch on a few examples, but it's definitely longer than 10 minutes. I will suggest an alternative, which is, why don't we put systems in place to support either option? So right now in Canada, we have university-owned, we have inventor-owned. Why don't we put systems in place, at least as a first step, before tackling the big problem of a uniform IP strategy? I will kind of raise the idea, should we even patent? There is an alternative, which is open source publishing, though I do believe that there's value in patenting, but I'll give an example. And then again, most importantly, is building the mentality and the incentives in addition to the systems to really support the commercialization. And so just a few examples globally. So we talked about in the US, it is PSI owned. In Sweden, it's professor owned, but they do suffer from fragmented commercialization of academic research. In Denmark, it is professor owned, but there is a duty of disclosure, and PSIs do have a first option to patent. Commercialization there is sort of in between. And then in Norway and the UK, it is PSI or the institution owned IP. And in the UK, they're actually quite successful with commercialization activities, and in part because they do have this uniform toolkit called the Lambert Toolkit that is designed to improve collaboration agreement between PSIs and private firms. And so just from international examples, it does seem like the PSI owned as opposed to professor owned might be the better way to go, but I'll just leave it as a teaser here because it is a bit of a larger conversation. Another option that I mentioned is open source. In an OECD report, businesses did say that they value collaborative research a lot more than patent and licensing based channels because mostly it costs them more money. And there is a consideration that the cost and complexity of actually building the IP library within the PSI is high. So as an example, this is a slightly older statistic, but in 2009, PSIs generated 67 million in income from IP, but it cost them nearly as much, or almost 57 million, to actually identify, protect, and promote this IP. And so there is the possibility of open access publication, but then we might lose the competitive advantage to some extent. And so I would argue that let's focus on IP, but let's mostly deal with the two main barriers, the mentality and the support structure. And I would say we have kind of four groups or four buckets of activities we can do: requirements, incentives, knowledge and access, and ecosystem and support. And a few proposals within those, in terms of requirements and incentives, we can have requirements with funding, we can have institutional and community incentives for research and incentives for the institutions themselves. And in terms of knowledge and access and ecosystem and support, we can have IP mapping and matchmaking, strengthening tech transfer support, ecosystem support. So in terms of requirements and incentives, as an example, academic promotion can depend in part on IP generation and commercialization activity, as well as collaboration and citations by the private sector. Right now, academic promotion is mostly about the academic sector, so publication in academic journals, not necessarily commercialization or innovation activity. Now, funding to PSIs or researchers from the government can include requirements for disclosure of innovation, patenting, commercialization activities. Right now, most funding programs do not have that requirement. And then we can have new funding programs designed to directly benefit SMEs that participate in technology transfer. So we do have funding programs for SMEs to work with PSIs, but not necessarily as much focusing on the late stage research or commercialization. So those are a few ideas, but I would really want to encourage the knowledge and access and ecosystem and support activities. Primarily, IP inventory mapping and matchmaking can be a really good first step of building a database that would help identify opportunities for businesses and the PSI sector and researchers to facilitate a more targeted matchmaking between Canadian IP holders and customers. It would also help policymakers align or better align Canada's IP policy with its economic development agenda. And it would help build the robust set of information and data analytics capability to really keep this going, both at the post-secondary institutions themselves, with partners, for example, research and technology parks. We have 27 of those across Canada that work closely with the academic institutions and are really focused on commercialization of academic research and supporting those activities, and through the ecosystem like partners. And touching on that, what can really help build that capability is ecosystem and knowledge sharing. So organizations like AUTUM, or the Association of University Technology Managers, does exist in Canada, but mostly works in the US. There are other examples across the world of these types of organizations that really support knowledge sharing among the different PSIs, specifically around innovation and commercialization activity. And then other options are more open models of innovation, including IP sharing strategies, patent pooling, technology bundles, data sharing, and examples of prioritizing IP access to private partners. And so I will leave you with one final idea, which is piloting for culture creation. If we test all of these proposals, let's say in 5 PSIs, so one by region across Canada, and really test a mix and match of all of these proposals to build and strengthen the culture, mentality, and support structure for commercialization and technology transfer activities within the post-secondary institution. So this would be the end of my talk today. I hope that I managed to at least get you thinking of, okay, there are steps that we can do that might not be incredibly grand, but there are steps we can take to really help support increase commercialization activity, either directly from the academic institutions or through collaboration with the private sector that we can start on today. So with that, I'll end, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them, and thank you so much. Okay, I will try to find them in the discussion forum. Okay, so is there any research to suggest how much of Canadian IP is being sold to foreign countries, possibly as a result of difficulty Canadian companies experience on the path to commercialization? So the answer is yes, there is research. It does look like Canadians do prefer to patent outside of Canada. It is not incredibly surprising. We are a fairly small market if you think of even just in comparison to our neighbor to the south. But there is still the value of, even if we do it outside of Canada, there is still the value of encouraging that activity. And I do think that the more that we build these capabilities, the more the companies, we heard Suresh talk about FDI or foreign direct investment, the more we might be able to actually attract big companies to come to Canada and to do their activity in Canada. And so I think the ideal goal would be to have both to sell to foreign entities, but to actually attract those entities to come to Canada. So hopefully that answers the question, and I'm happy to also follow offline to talk about sort of the numbers of how much is being sold here or there. And then a second question, one of the critiques in academia is that faculty members devote too much time to research and not enough on teaching and training the next generation. Wouldn't something like the Bayh-Dole Act further incentivize faculty members to devote their efforts away from teaching training to spend on commercialization activity? So that's a really great question. I would argue that the answer is no. I would argue that actually building the mentality and how do we incentivize promotion and success within academia should include all of these. And so I do think that the system right now is skewed toward really one thing, which is sort of the publish in the academic circles. But if we actually rethink how do we incentivize researchers, I do think, I agree, it has to include both the commercialization activity as well as the training. And also think that commercialization activity and innovation should really include the next generation or the talent. And so it shouldn't just be the researcher or the professor. They should really involve undergraduate students and graduate students in those activities, because that's really how we tackle yet another problem, which is building the Canadian talent pipeline. And so I would say it's really rethinking within the post-secondary institution or the post-secondary ecosystem. If we really think cohesively about all of our targets, I do think they can actually work really well together. So again, incentivize the research to do all, and really engage the students and the talent in the commercialization activities. And then I think there's one last question, which is there's a relatively new tool database for showcasing public sector IP that is available for licensing, Explore IP. Oh, so that's great to know. So I encourage everybody, and I will look at it as well. I know that this has been discussed for a long time, and there are organizations like the Association of University Research Parks that have wanted to support it. And so the more we can actually open this, I think it would be great. And the more we can actually have the conversation and realize there are small steps we can take. In one portal like this can grow and include more. So there's definitely room to improve. And I'm really happy to see that there is interest in this. So thank you again.
Everyone, welcome for joining us now, and thank you to all the previous speakers and their presentations. I'm a master student at Concordia University and the co-founder of CP3, Concordia Precious Plastic Project, and I'm Dr. Katja Schmidt, an associate professor in the Center for Engineering and Society at Concordia University, who studies policy issues with significant scientific, social, and ethical uncertainty. I'm here to share with you the potential limitations of implementing a local closed-loop plastic recycling program following a circular economy model and using CP3 as an example, but I will discuss it a little later. To begin, I really wanted to hear from you, and if we can launch, as I've created a poll and I wanted to know how much plastic waste do you think Canadians produce each year? So if we're able to launch the poll now, and I'll give you a couple seconds to answer what your guesses are of how much plastic waste Canadians produce each year. And then if we can share the results. Wow, perfect. So, well, most of you said more than 5 million tons. The correct answer is actually 3.8 million tons of plastic waste each year. And if we can go back to my presentation, just for a visual, that's 24 CN towers, which is a lot of waste. So most of you guessed more than that, but actually maybe in your eyes we're doing a little better, but it's still a lot of waste that we're producing, and we're on track to be making more than 3.8 million. Of the total amount of plastic waste produced, only 9% of it. The rest will be incinerated to create energy, which alone causes a lot of pollution and health issues, or it will go to landfill or end up in our oceans, or even sent overseas for developing countries to take care of. Even though plastic and virgin plastic continues to be produced, our waste management system just can't keep up with the demands. Our current traditional waste management system puts responsibilities on the consumer to properly sort and manage their waste, often using multiple different sorting bins, such as the ones that we see here. However, products are usually made from different types of materials, and they're not always easily disassembled or identified the type of material that it is. So if I use a very standard pen, for example, a plastic pen, the majority of it's made out of plastic. There's obviously the ink in the center. There's also some metal components, and this specific one has a rubber end where you hold it. So different types of materials. How do I disassemble this? Which bin do I put it in? These are questions that the consumer has to ask themselves before disposing of recyclable waste. Moreover, recyclable waste is often collected all together and then goes to the same facility. So we often mix our glass, our paper, our plastic, and our metal, or even if we separate them, it will be taken care of at the same facility. Sorting at recycling facilities is often then done by hand, which is not a time-consuming or efficient way to deal with our waste. And I might add that we just sorted our waste, or we thought we sorted our waste, and yet again, it's being sorted again. Contamination at this stage is also a huge issue. It can be expensive, and thus facilities will just remove contaminated materials and send them to landfill instead of dealing with them in-house at a facility. Furthermore, products are designed without considering the total life cycle. So material selection is based on functionality, aesthetics, and expense, and excluding the product's end of life. Once again, consumers are asked to live with this new 6R approach, which is to rethink their purchases, to refuse plastic items, to repair broken items, to reduce their plastic waste, to reuse or repurpose to extend the life cycle, and finally, as the very last step, is to recycle that plastic item. But why aren't manufacturers using this 6R approach? To rethink during the design phase the total life cycle of a product, to refuse a material that is not easily recycled, to repair damaged products from their own supply chain or accept broken items from their customers, to reuse different types of materials used in their products, to make their designs have dual purpose in order to be reused, and finally, ensure that their products can be recycled by material selection and identification. At CP3, we are trying to tackle this problem. We are a multidisciplinary student-led initiative bracing Concordia University's plastic waste management by recycling on-site and raising awareness about the plastic crisis. We are a group of students from all faculties united by the goal of protecting the environment and giving plastic waste a new life. And we do this in two ways. First, we raise awareness about the plastic crisis through our social media platforms, where we provide information about the current state of the problem, as well as information for the community members to make a difference on their own. The second way is by closing the loop between all the plastic waste produced on campus. The benefit of this is allowing plastic items to have a new life and be recycled on site and reduce the amount of plastic waste we are sending to landfill. The process is first to collect, wash, and separate the plastic waste. Next is to granulate into smaller pellet sizes using a shredder, and finally transform it into different types of products. This initiative is based on the International Precious Plastic Project that inspires individuals to tackle plastic waste issues in their own community. The limitation here is to ensure that all products created will be able to enter and re-enter the closed loop system over again. For example, prototyping is a very popular, however, it's often not identified with the traditional symbol and number, and thus can create a lot of waste because there's no way to identify what type of material it's made out of. We are implementing that all products 3D printed on campus, be stamped before they're collected to be recycled, and this way we can know the type of material that they're made out of and give it reserve. Well, we will be creating recycled filament for all labs on campus to use, which is not something that you can find on the market. In a dedicated student center where we will be promoting multidisciplinary research and projects in order to tackle the plastic crisis and explore new solutions together. So I've added our social media accounts here and our email, and you have questions offline, we're happy to answer. But I'm gonna just switch over, and at the time I'm gonna ask Dr. Ketcher-Schmidt a question in order to start this short discussion, and then we're happy to take questions from the chat as well. So hi, Dr. Schmidt, how are you?
I'm great. How are you, Sarah?
Good. So my question for you is around regulation in circular economy. And it's common to hear that consumers' behaviors and habits are the issues of plastic waste. However, we're still just reliant on consumers changing their habits instead of looking at the root of the problem. And even recently at the COP26 summit, it was mentioned that implementing a circular economy wouldn't solve too many issues because virgin plastic is still being produced and still being made. But I'm curious, in your opinion, what policies or regulations can help small businesses to implement this circular economy versus relying on consumer habits?
Wow, there's so much in that question. And first of all, you did a really great job on that presentation. So as a first stop, in a sense, of course, when we're still producing more plastic, there's a limit to what the benefit can be. But I don't think that's any reason not to pursue it. I think it's really vital that we do pursue it. And the thing that really struck me was this exact question that you asked: why are we not asking this of corporations? As a consumer, I'm sure many of you have tried to reduce plastic. It's really a very difficult thing to do. And yet the framing tends to be consumer asking this of corporations. So to me, I think Concordia is a great example as a place that has the political will and the resources to put towards a program like this. What is interesting to me is how do we scale this up into a broader society? Concordia is looking at having a closed loop plastic recycling system, which is so important, but how do we find this in the broader society? We need to ask more of corporations. We also need to find a political will to have policy implemented that requires this as well.
I completely agree. And I also think that just traceability in general of where the plastic waste is being produced and then where it's going after would also help to enable this closed loop system. So, you know, at CP3, we're trying to track what labs are doing and what students' research are doing in order to say, oh, we can actually recycle that on site. And I think that would be interesting to implement, like you said, on a corporate level where products that are being made every day can be traceable of, you know, where they end up versus just, you know, making it someone else's problem to deal with that waste.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I don't see any questions in the chat, but if offline, if anyone has any questions, we'd be happy to answer them. Oh, I guess we'll leave the next.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for your attention and participation today. The topic for this talk will be the integration of the North American region in a post-COVID world. I'll introduce Professor Rubén España. Professor Rubén España has more than 25 years of experience in different industries, such as catering for services for airlines, working under the just-in-time system for supplies and retail, often in charge of import-exports. He's mainly experienced in logistics, international trade, and distribution-related topics. He is currently teaching English and economics in the Tecnológico de Estudios Superiores de Coacalco in Mexico, and will be talking to us about the strengthening of North American integration in a post-COVID world and opportunities provided by the United States, Canada, and Mexico agreement. Professor, thank you for joining us today. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Karina, for kind words. So we are a region, and we know it. We are the North American region, and we have an agreement on that on trade. The Canada, U.S. and Mexico agreement. You Canadian know it as for us Mexicans is the TMEC, Tratado Comercial entre México, Estados Unidos y Canadá. So anyhow, is regional. It is a fact. The region is happening. North America is here, and we have the opportunity to strengthen this region more than trade. There are myriad of relationships happening right now between the humans. Will more than half a billion living in this area, so we are in this agreement. Next slide, please. Okay, the first thing, it is implied on the trade agreement supply. Annually, we have more $1 trillion in trade in intra-region, North America region, Canada, US, and Mexico. And as you probably know, the supply chains are a major overhaul. Uh, and companies are decoupling from China. The local is strengthening. So we are in the same neighborhood. We can be complementary. We have the population, and we are training that population in Mexico. Our demographic pyramid is at the same time, Canadian demographic pyramid is aging, and this is kind of mixed. We may complement each other. So there are opportunities there to strengthen the supply chain and to strengthen as well the trade, which the rules of origin in the new NAFTA, the rules of origin from 66% to 75%, mainly in the auto industry. So there is going to be an increase on trade on that segment. Next slide, please. Well, I just mentioned migration and graphics. The demographic pyramid in Mexico is mainly young. In US and Canada is aging population. But I mentioned that we each other. At the same time, there are more than 1 million Americans living right now in Mexico. Mainly, those are retirees. There is around 12,000 Canadians living also in Mexico. Those are, in a sense, economic migrants because Mexico is remarkably cheaper than the US and Canada. So once we fix in Mexico the violence problem we have, that is a fact, I think we can enhance the population of retirees coming into Mexico, where the weather, as you know, is wonderful. Next slide, please. Okay. Well, this is a global issue, the climate change, and which is affecting us. This is an existential threat. And at the same time, how our of the natural resources we have is one of the lungs of the planet. You have plenty of forestry, but so is Mexico. We south part of Mexico, we have plenty of green areas. So we need to take care of. In Mexico, the current administration maybe is not showing good signs towards the protection of the environment. However, the three nations can strengthen the environmental policies, and we can, at some point in the future, revisit the goals of greenhouse gases, and revisiting them in the sense that we can reduce the time frame. Maybe before the international consensus has been talking about, maybe not by 2040, but before. On this, we need to agree, the three nations, and we need to agree in a common policy towards this phenomenon, the climate change. we in Mexico has a lot of homework to do because, as I told you, maybe the current government is not sending the appropriate signals. We are right now having on Congress Energy Act to be discussed. In that Energy Act, the priority is fuels. It has faced strong oppositions in Mexico from both the political class, but also from companies and on the trade. They are opposed to this act. It is right now frozen. I think it's not going to pass over the Congress because we, Mexico, we need to send a strong signal towards our commitment to protect the environment. Next slide, please. Okay, education and trilateral cooperation. On this, I think, I believe we can do exactly what we are doing right now. I mean, communicate and interact the three nations together. Because beyond COSMA and some other forums, there's a remarkable lack of communication channels, trilateral communication channels. Canada and Mexico, everyone on their sides prefers to communicate directly with the US. What happened in the previous week is maybe an omen in a way. We are going to work more and more on trilateral forums because this is the future in the short term. The region, the North American region, should strain the ties we have right now. So this is a good signal for the three of us, and I believe we is by going to the universities, by discussing in forums such like this, strengthen the communication among each other, cooperate, and try to communicate to each other, because this is, as I told you, this is going to happen. Even though the governments are not, maybe they are actively working on this, this is going to happen, the North American region. Please. Okay, Homeland Security. Well, this is commonplace. It's always discussed something related to Homeland. Well, it is commonplace because it is important. The Homeland Security is paramount in every nation, in every region. Right now, we are seeing the rising of on both of the political spectrum. The far right is a concern in the US, so in Canada and Mexico, not that so. But we have the cartels here in Mexico, and they are a threat, direct threat to our countries. So, between the three nations is strengthened regarding this issue and to take care of the money laundering and the financing of illegal or terror activities. On this issue, we need also closer, maybe the governments have already working closer on existential threat. So this is an issue that we need to take care and pay attention on. And this is it. Next, please. This is it. I really appreciate your attention. Thank you all. Karina, thank you very much. If you have any questions, please go ahead. Discussion forum. Okay. There is no questions. Okay.
So,
Okay, thank you very much.
My subject is going to depart a bit from your very interesting presentation, more of the academic, and I work on the idea I work on the demographics of social communicators science communicators in Canada. I had the honor of taking part in 2018, 2019, 2020 in the first and only so far longitudinal study of science communication in Canada. And thanks to my inclusion, it was not limited to English-speaking Canada, but I managed to go, which is often left out of such analysis. Could it be possible to move the slide, please? Okay, this is, everyone is familiar with Canada, and we have two main associations, Science Communication Association in Canada, the SWCC, Science Writers and Communicators of Canada, which is mainly Anglophone, and the ACS, Association des Communicateurs Scientifiques du Québec, which is obviously mainly based in Quebec, and Francophone. However, the repartition of the science communicators in Canada are in declining order of population are in Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia, which shouldn't be a surprise as they are the three most populous provinces in Canada. We also managed to get in touch and to survey I don't know if communicators are the best term because they not necessarily qualify themselves as such, but who engage in science communication in one form or another, mainly on social media, and we managed to reach them on Twitter and Instagram. Please change the slide. So the findings I will present will be separated in three parts. First, what is common to Canada, the ongoing trends. Second, the divergence, what is still different between English Canada and Quebec on the one hand, and what is different between association-based communicators and social media-based communicators on a second. Please change the slide. So, what is common to both English Canada and Quebec is that the profession of science communicators is highly feminized, with more than 2/3. And the age is working age. People between the majority of science communicators in association are between 25 and 60. Shouldn't be a surprise because science communicators are actually as an expression and evolution of science journalists, which are professionally associated to journals, now more and more freelance, but they need to have experience before becoming science communicators. Please change the slide. Could you please change the slide? Okay, thank you. So science communicators in Canada present a wide variety of topics. The most popular are environmental science and biology, and the least popular are politics. You may wonder why social sciences, humanities, and other non-science, non-art science were included in the topic. It's because, on the analysis, is because we do consider also the social implication of science in science communication. However, what is significant is that the majority of science communicators in Canada deal with usually more than 5 topics, so plurality of topics. They're not simply medicine or physics. In order to reach lay public, they need to discuss a variety of topics, themes, usually related to ongoing actualities and the news and discoveries. Could you change the slide, please? Okay. So, the traditional form, as I said, is text as science writers, when you're science journalists, when the original science communicators, even the SWCC, Science Writers and Communicators of Canada, recently changed its name because they thought that the original name, the Canadian Science Writers Association, did not reflect the increasing diversity of the profession or the activity. And so we have a plurality of media, and we have increasingly online video, audio, animation that has been adopted by science communicators. And again, as for theme, the science communicators do not merely limit themselves to a single medium today. Though texts remain the basis of communication, they're usually associated with at least two other types of medium. Please change the slide. So another interesting fact about science communication is that more than 50% consider it their main occupation. So whether they are employed as such or they are freelance, they devote the majority of the time to science communication activities. However, and this is significant, it need not mean that it is their main source of income. To this, I will come back later. And interestingly, is that with the development of social media, it has become a prerequisite for science communicators in Canada to use social media in order to reach the public and to actually engage in science communication. However, the more we look at older professionals, they tend to use social media and internet more widely, but they usually leave it to other members of their team or their entourage. Could you change the slide, please? Of course, the past graph I showed are common for both Quebec and Canada. There are slight differences, but the gist is the same. We do have converging trend regardless of languages and tradition and culture. However, still, there is some significant difference between Quebec and Canada, but they're not based on language. They are based on institution, the institutionalized, the history of the profession in both. Could you please change the slide? So, what is interesting is that although 50 and more percent of Canadian science communicators derive their main source of income from science communication activities, it is an higher proportion in Quebec than in the rest of Canada. And so it raises the question for English-speaking, or now we could say English-speaking science communicators, that there's a discrepancy between their time spent in science communication and their source of income. So whether it is a hobby or a side activity, or if it's their main, but they have lack of resources, a topic I will come back to. Could you please change the slide? This is also interesting distinction. So globally, employment type with what we call full-time permanent for the study, which is the majority self-reported occupation, is institutionalized either to a university, an enterprise, but they are on full-time contract, usually unionized full-time contract. And we do see that in Canada, there's a rise in self-employment freelance. And so nearly soon we're going to have an equivalent. So roughly there's going to be the same amount of science communicators, which will be in full-time permanent position and in freelance position. However, in Quebec, the situation is more pronounced. Nearly twice as much of science communicators, twice as many, are still full-time permanent, either working for government, universities, schools, CJEP, the media. And this is a difference in the profession. So it's still a regulated, institutionalized profession in Quebec compared to the rest of Canada. Could you please change the slide? So, and it also translates in the difference in where they are in which type of institution or work sector they are actually employed. We do see that when we look at even if although in Canada there's still majority of the time is consecrated to science communication, it might not be the main source of income. And we can see that when they need to self-report their area of work, so formal area of work, majority take other, which unfortunately for the point of this analysis remain undefined, because still we can see that in Quebec the majority are still in the traditional professions, university, news media outlet, cultural organization, museums, which are not as much reported for Canada. Of course, there's still the 15% more, nearly 15% unemployed, which also interesting, meaning that it can be considered that science communication activities are so they're still in traditional functions. Could you please change the slide? So, in Canada, in addition to science, the majority background are the traditional communication function, journalism, communication, public relation, sometimes even marketing. However, in Quebec, the overwhelming majority, nearly 60%, are coming from hard sciences. And so they do not have as such communication training, or it is not the main source of training. Sorry about the sun. I will try to communication. So they do come with a science background and the ability to understand the topic and to explain it, whereas sometimes communicators and journalists come to science data and they need to interpret it, and there's the added difficulty of interpretation. But still is the idea that science is still in Quebec the main area of training before moving to science communication. Call it a shift of profession. Could you please change the slide? Okay. So usually there's, as I said, there's not that much formal training in science communication, whether in Canada or Quebec. Most report to be self-taught, which will be through experience and practice as actually doing science communication. However, you may see that in Quebec, the degree, the second category is degree. So small, nearly 15% do have training, formal training, and degree granting education. And this is because the development of science communication program in Quebec dates back to the 1980s, which is at least 10 to 15 years before the rest of Canada. So there is this possibility, but still it remains a minority track for actually becoming a science communication. Could you please change the slide? This is also interesting why communicate science. The discrepancy of response of answers in both Canada and Quebec might actually come from incorporation of terms and the meanings associated with the term. So it's classic, increase public awareness, increase science literacy. However, the main difference is engagement. And so engagement remains the third most pointed reason in Canada, but it's nearly zero in Quebec. This might be because although science engagement has become a major theme, engagement with the public for the science communication profession and research since the late 90s, since the House of Lords report. The concept of engagement was never actually translated in French. There's no discussion of this term, and what might be surprising is that the discussion in Quebec about term is marginally related to the discussion in France and other Francophone countries, and the impact, contrary to what we may believe, is the discussion in Quebec have actually preceded the discussion going on in France for the terms. So actually, in Quebec, it's still moving thing of culture, whereas in France, they are, in other terms, they're always changing because of evolving unionized interests. But the point remains that if in Canada the interest is other or more, and second is awareness in Quebec, and the idea of form opinions, say, shape opinion, which is not exactly the same function of awareness and opinion. Still, this would require, in order to really understand the difference, a more semi-directed interview with select science communicators. Could you please change the slide? Then there's this new category of science communicators which are emerging in Canada and of course in other countries, is those who are based on social media. They start on social media, and what is interesting is that they may not necessarily refer to themselves as science communicators, although they do engage with science communicators. We have found them because we have used algorithm in order to scan Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and all those social media in order to search for key terms in their activities. So we have quite a few interesting numbers. So we identified nearly 200, but we don't know at this stage if it's representative or not of the actual population of purely social science, purely social media based communicators. Could you change the slide? So there is the social media science communicator, or as I said, mainly focused on using social media. This is where they are. They do not necessarily reach traditional organization, though they tend to turn into form informal and fluid networks among themselves and their public. Of course, they are among the most likely to use social media on a daily basis. And roughly there is a similar pattern of using the various social media. The difference between Quebec and Canada is mainly that Facebook is still more important than Twitter, whereas for English speakers it's reversed. This might be linked to the fact that there's a limited number of characters for using Twitter, and that French has more article and structure. The grammatical structures of the sentences are a bit more complex. Could you change the slide, please? What is also interesting in regarding social media science communicators is that they're usually younger. They are younger than 30, and they do not have many years of experience. Of course, it stands to reason as social media has gained traction over the past decade. Still, there's the difference of age. So younger for social media, older for association, and there's also the level of experience. So we're dealing to some extent with amateurs. Of course, it may come that they will become self-taught and that they will be comparable. But at this level, they are among the population we have identified, they are not yet what we could call experienced. They are very tech savvy, but we don't know if they could compare in level of science content. Could you please change the slide? So the difference between association based and social science, social media based communicators is also reflected in the main worries. So while for ACS, for instance, the object is project funding for social media communicators, and also for SWCC, but there's a twist. The object is income generation. There's similarity between funding and income, but it's not exactly the same. There's major differences. One is livelihood derived from social media, science communication activity, and in the other hand, there's a distinction. It's really specific to projects, because in Canada and in Quebec since the 1990s, there's been there's been lowering of investment in government and institutional support for science communication activities at the very moment where science communication has become important, especially with the rise of social media, Internet 2.0. Also, for SWCC, we also see that generating income is major, but because in the rest of Canada, as we have seen, freelancing has been rising and will probably equal institutionalized jobs. So there's difficult to see freelancing, which is also the case to some extent for social media science communicators, income and funding for activities. Would it be possible to change the slide? Well, I want to thank you. It's nearly noon for those who are in Eastern time. I know you must be hungry, but I hope I have given you some food for thought. Thank you very much.